Under a sky of copper, dusk, and wind-blown dust, the land once called Assyria still breathes, though its breath is silent now. The ziggurats rise like broken teeth from the earth, their steps weathered by time, their altars long abandoned. But something lingers in the heat, something older than memory, older than mercy. It hums beneath the cracked stone and settles like smoke in the hollows where kings once ruled with a hand of fire and fear. And if you walk the ruins when the wind is right, when it whistles low and cruel across the plains, you might hear it, not voices, not footsteps, but the soft, sickening rip of flesh leaving bone. The Assyrian kings, gods in mortal skin, ruled not by consent but by dread. Their empire, forged in blood and script, stretched like a whip across Mesopotamia. Their laws were etched in cuneiform, firm and final, but it was not ink or stylus that kept the cities obedient. It was the flayer's hand in the great courts of Nineveh, surrounded by the sandstone murals of battle and glory. Rebels were brought forward, not for judgment, for there was none but for demonstration. Stripped of rank, name, and dignity, they were offered not death, but an ending far slower, far louder, flaying. The art of peeling the soul from its skin. It was done with reverence, they say. As a priest would offer incense, so too would the executioner prepare his tools, bronze blades, hooks, and padded clamps. The condemned would be bound upright, often with limbs splayed, the body made canvas. Before gathered crowd soldiers, scribes, supplicants, the blade would begin its descent, slow and certain. Along the arms, down the back, across the thighs. The flesh peeled like fruit rind, curling from the muscle in slick ribbons. The victim lived for most of it. That was the point. A choir of silence fell upon the audience, broken only by breathless moans or the wet rustle of tissue. The agony was not only tolerated, was exalted. For Assyria, this was more than punishment. It was statecraft. To be flayed was to become a warning stitched in blood. Some were nailed, still breathing, to the walls of the ziggurat, their bodies baking beneath the brutal sun. Others were skinned entirely, their remains cast into the river as offerings to the gods of vengeance. And the skins, some were stretched upon city gates, a flag of failure, a tapestry of terror. No voice cried for mercy, no scroll recorded their names. The Assyrian scribes chronicled battles with poetic flourish, but went silent on the screams of their empire. In the halls of Ashurbanipal, whose library collected the world's knowledge, there is no page that speaks of the flesh that fed the dirt. Only stone reliefs, frozen parades of victory, prisoners tied and kneeling tell fragments of the truth. The rest is shadow. Modern hands, archaeologists, historians, poets now, sift through the sand for whispers. They uncover tablets lauding kings for bringing order, but never revealing the price. They find bones in shallow graves with no skin, no burial rites. Some say the methods were reserved only for rebels. Others believe even whispers of dissent were enough to earn the kiss of the blade. But a darker theory lingers in the silence, that the flaying was not only deterrent but devotion, that within the screams the kings heard praise, that suffering became a kind of music, a liturgy for an empire that prayed not for peace, but permanence. And yet nothing is permanent. The Assyrians, for all their grandeur, for all their cruelty, fell. Their cities burned, their palaces turned to ash beneath the boots of invaders. The ziggurats crumbled, the murals shattered, the flayers vanished, their knives rusted into dust. But the wind remembers, and in the cracked earth of ancient Nineveh, beneath the thornbrush and sun-baked stone, There are places where the silence is not empty. Some say you can still feel the fear etched into the ground, that if you stand where the victims once stood, you will feel your skin crawl not from cold, but from something older, a memory, a warning, a scream to long buried. There is no monument for the flayed, no tomb, no scroll, no song, only a silence that cuts sharper than any blade, and in that silence the question lingers like smoke. What kind of power demands such screams, and what kind of world lets them echo still? We speak of empires as if they were marble, but even marble bleeds when cracked. Assyria ruled by the knife, by fear, by skin peeled in sunlight, and now only ruins, only dust, only echoes of the sacred. Horror once called justice. Listen long enough, and you may hear it the past, not as memory, but as wound. And beneath the dust of the ages, still glistening, still raw, the skin that was never buried, never mourned, waits for its story to be told. A shadow crawls across the fjord, long and whispering, as though memory itself moves through the dark. There, in the winter's throat, when the sea turns to iron and breath clouds, like ghosts, stories stir in the bones of the north. They speak of wings carved from men's backs, of blood that steamed in the snow, of screams that were not quite human, rising, falling, like some terrible bird had taken flight in the gloom. The wind howls, as it always has, carrying echoes of a ritual that may never have been, but also never quite wasn't. The blood eagle dot in the 9th century. Among the frostbitten kingdoms of Norway and its distant cousins, justice came with axes. Not the swift, silent blade of kings, but the slow, deliberate cruelty of gods. Odin, the Allfather, who hung himself for wisdom and plucked out his eye for knowledge, demanded sacrifices both noble and grim. And so they say, when vengeance was sacred and oaths were broken, the blood eagle was summoned, the condemned usually a traitor. Sometimes a defeated noble was dragged to the longhouse or to the cliffside, beneath the open eye of the gods. Stripped, shackled, and forced to kneel, their fate unfolded like a saga in flesh. First, the back was split open, the ribs cracked one by one from the spine like branches from a tree. Then, with hands hardened by frost and war, the lungs were pulled from the cavity and spread outward so they fluttered like wings. Some say salt was rubbed into the wounds. Others whisper that incense burned nearby, masking the scent of death. It was not enough to kill. It had to be beautiful. It had to mean something. Skaldic poets, the keepers of Viking memory, did not shout this punishment from their horns. They whispered it, like prayer or curse. A tale told around firelight, where children dared not breathe. They etched it into sagas Hafredal, Halfridge naming kings like Glar of Northumbria, whose chest was said to be opened by the sons of Ragnar Lothbrok. The sagas don't linger on the screams. They speak instead of honor, vengeance, and the silence that followed. But was it true? Archaeologists sift through the peat, brushing away centuries of frost and folklore. In a burial mound near Trondheim, a skeleton was found with rib bones splayed wide, shattered not by time but by tools, deep, deliberate marks. No lungs, of course, only a void where the myth might live. Some say it's proof. Others say the body was merely ravaged by animals or weather. No one agrees. But the wound speaks, and yet even the truth may be shaped by terror. Some scholars believe the blood eagle never happened, that it was Christian chroniclers who invented it, twisting the brutal but mundane violence of Norse justice into something monstrous. a cultural weapon, a warning to the West. Look what these pagans do, yet the runes remain, and in them strange patterns. Words like eagle paired with back and bones and gods. In Icelandic poetry, the eagle is a symbol of death and glory, circling above the battlefield, hungering for flesh, and perhaps the ritual was not literal, but metaphora. Way to describe how a traitor was broken, exposed, and offered to the gods. A bird not born of feathers, but of fear. Still, the sagas are precise. They do not blink. Imagine it now. The dim longhouse, the scent of pine smoke and burning meat. The hush as the ritual begins. Men kneel in fur-lined cloaks, not watching but listening. The sound of bones splitting, the gasp of the dying, ragged and wet. A skald begins to recite the names of ancestors. Odin watches from the carved beams, his eye dark as night. A life ends not with silence, but with myth. Was it punishment, or theatre, or both? In a world where death was a door, and pain a prayer, perhaps this was not cruelty, but communion. To suffer so greatly that the gods could not ignore you. To die in pieces, but become immortal in story. The blood eagle does not ask to be believed. It only waits, wings open, in the fog of legend, and when the wind moans low across the fjord. It sounds like breath forced from a broken chest. A memory that never leaves. A scream that grew wings. Beneath the breathless hush of the Persian dawn, there is a silence deeper than death, thick and warm, like sand pressed over a scream. It hums between the bricks of ancient tombs, in the mortared shadows of Persepolis, where gods were fed on devotion and kings carved their names into the bones of time. And if you listen long enough, if you place your ear to the walls and close your eyes, you might hear it, the slow drag of fingernails across stone, the soft murmur of a prayer that never reached daylight. They called it a murmenta word, heavy with dread, to be sealed alive, not killed outright, but buried standing, entombed in brick while still breathing. In the age of Darius the Great, ruler of a vast and solemn empire, justice was not always swift, but it was final, sacred, and suffocating. Disobedience, especially among the priests of Ahura Mazda, was not met with flame or blade, but with stillness. A wall, a whisper, and then the long, unraveling silence of a man forgotten. The Zoroastrian creed demanded purity not just in body, but in soul, thought, and tongue. Priests were the custodians of divine fire, keepers of a truth too sacred for misstep. And so, when one strayed whether by blasphemy, by treason, or by failure, they were not cast to wolves or hanged for spectacle. No, they were brought before the sacred masons, whose hands knew the language of stone and silence. In a narrow alcove, carved beneath the foundation of the king's cities, the condemned was placed upright, his hands bound behind him with cords dipped in sacred ash. The cavity was no larger than a coffin, though it was vertical, as if the soul must climb its way out. There, without judgment from the crowd, without trial or tears, the opening was sealed brick by brick. The final stone slid into place not with ceremony, but with quiet finality, like a door shutting behind the last breath of a forgotten god. Some say the condemned whispered prayers to the bricks. Not for salvation, none would come but for memory. That someone, someday, might touch the wall and remember. The Persians did not leave names etched into those stone prisons. There were no markers, no offerings, no signs, only walsum, thicker than others, some oddly resonant within them. the quiet hollowness that made masons pause and turn pale at Persepolis. Royal tombs stare out over the broken sprawl of a vanished empire. Carved high into the cliffs, the facades speak of power, order, eternity. But below, deep within the servant tunnels and sacrificial foundations, are strange gaps in the brickwork sealed shafts with no purpose, no writing. In one such niche, restorers working under flickering lamps pressed against a sealed cavity and heard something that did not belong in stone. Not a voice, no, but a stillness that responded to sound, like breath behind a curtain. Greek historians wrote of such deaths, their accounts painted in horror and awe. They told of priests whose crimes were whispered, not shouted, of men who knelt before temple bricks and begged, not for forgiveness, but for sleep. One chronicler, Heraclitus, claimed he heard from a caravan guide of a priest who lasted 3 days behind the wall scraping, whispering, singing ancient verses until his voice withered. No bones were ever found, but at dawn the bricks wept. Salt, there were rules, even in punishment. The condemned was given water, a single bowl, sometimes food, but only once, enough to ensure the suffering lasted longer than justice required. Some say this was mercy. Others say it was ritual, a passage of purification before the soul reached the sacred fire, burned away of sin by hunger and fear. But not all who were sealed were priests. Some were lovers of those they should not have touched. Some were messengers who carried letters that bore forbidden ink. Some were women, yes, even in Persia, whose knowledge of sacred rites rivaled the Magi. And when they were found, or feared, or silenced, they too were taken to the brick. The bricks were not ordinary. They were burned in lime, infused with herbs. Sacred words were pressed into their wet clay before firing. Not names, never names, but symbols of binding, of silence, of oaths broken and buried. Some believe these bricks were not to contain the body, but to mute the spirit, to keep their voices from rising in the afterlife and accusing the living. And yet they speak still, not in words, but in that unquiet quiet behind the walls. In Persepolis, in Susa, in the forgotten cities where the walls run deep, archaeologists speak of the hollows, of places in the foundations that ring different when tapped, of cavities that yield no echo and no entry. In one such place, a single scratch mark was found deep, deliberate, as though someone inside had struck with a stone once, in defiance. A final gesture, no bones, no dust, just that wound in the stone, sealed beneath 20 feet of royal walkway. What did they think, those final moments? Did they curse the king, beg the gods, or did they surrender, speaking sacred verses into the dark, hoping that the bricks themselves would carry their words through time? And in a way, they have, because we still speak of them. We still wonder, in the midnight hush, what it feels like to breathe one's last in darkness, wrapped in silence, embraced by stone. There is something sacred in a death without witness, something monstrous, too. It is not spectacle, it is sacrifice. Not execution, but Erasure. Darius, great as he was, feared chaos, feared impurity, feared the voice that might rise against order. And so he buried them, not only to end them, but to unmake them, to fold their existence back into the walls that held his empire high. But stone remembers. It holds heat longer than flesh. It whispers, in pressure and pattern, the shapes of forgotten sorrow. And in those sealed spaces, behind the bricks of tombs, no one dares reopen. The memory of those immured still lingers, not in form, not in name, but in silence. A silence too deliberate to be empty. A silence that presses into your skin when you walk too close. A silence that does not forget. The desert never forgets. It whispers through the dunes, over shattered statues and crumbling pylons. Its breath dry and hollow like the silence left behind by amputated cries. Somewhere near Saqqara, where the sun sears the limestone brighter than gold, the wind curls. Itself around a half-buried limb-just bone now, weathered and pale. The fingers still curled, as if grasping a truth no one dares speak aloud, here. Beneath the ever-watching eye of Ra, the dead do not rest in silence. They are counted, documented, preserved not whole, but dismembered. There is an inventory for the lost, not of jewels or scrolls, but of hands, severed, ritualized, catalogued, each a punishment, each a symbol, each a warning. In the time of the Old Kingdom, when the Nile still flowed with the dreams of 100 kings and priests, still carried their voices like thunder through the hall of Mat. Theft was not merely a crime, it was a cosmic betrayal. The tomb was not a grave, but a bridge between the seen and the unseen. To steal from it was to rob a soul of eternity. And so, the punishment was not just death, but dismemberment. Specifically, the hand that stole, the hand that reached where it should not, the hand that touched the sacred without permission. And yet, it was not discarded. No, the severed hand was often returned not to the family, not to the condemned, but to the temple, to the priests, to the caretakers of the tomb itself. Imagine the ritual, a thief caught beneath the flickering torchlight, dragged into the chamber of judgment, their pleas ignored as the gods watched in hieroglyphic silence. The blade raised, a final breath, then flesh meets steel, and from the body the hand is taken, not just as evidence, but as offering. Some papyri remain, fragile, worn, ink faded by time's cruel touch. They list them, 2 arms of a male, unnamed, delivered to the tomb of Unas, 1 right hand branded with scar, 3 hands from 3 men taken at dusk. And still we do not know if they were placed beside the coffins they desecrated, or buried alone in cursed sand. We only know they were given back, and that they were counted. On the walls of certain tombs in Saqqara, the scene repeats, a row of men kneeling, some blindfolded, others staring ahead with blank, hollow eyes. In front of them, on stone altars or raised slabs, their arms are stretched, not drawn back in resistance, but laid down in surrender. Nearby, a man, his face calm, almost serene, lifts a blade. In the background, another priest holds a basket. Inside, hands, just hands, stiff, bloodless, waiting to be taken where no soul may follow. Centuries passed, the sand rose and fell, dynasties crumbled, names were swallowed by time, but the hands remained. Archaeologists, careful not to disturb the sleeping dead, have uncovered them, not just 1 or 2, many, scattered among the tomb shafts, some near the burial sites of known kings, others near priests, others still in places too damaged to identify. The bones are cleanly cut, no splintering, no shattering, just precise amputation, wrist or forearm. Always right, sometimes both. The flesh, of course, is long gone, but the story lingers. Was it justice or something else? Why offer the hand back to the tomb it defiled? Was it to appease the spirit within, to balance a scale no mortal could see? The Book of the Dead speaks of hearts being weighed, but never hands. Yet perhaps, in some darker, unrecorded ritual, the hand was its own measure, a limb sacrificed to silence the restless soul of a robbed pharaoh, a piece of the thief given back in hope that the gods might spare the rest. Or perhaps it was fear, a deeper, stranger fear, the belief that the hand that stole might steal again even in death, and so to bury it apart, to remove it from the body before it could haunt or harm, to scatter the thief's power inch by inch, joint by joint, until all that remained was a memory too mutilated to return. There is a theory, whispered only in certain corners of Egyptology, that some of the severed hands were mummified, not as a kindness, but as a containment, wrapped and bound in linen, sealed with resin, buried beneath cursed idols, trapped in the underworld forever, unable to reach or grasp again, like insects pinned beneath glass. But perhaps the most disturbing question is not why they cut off the hands, but who made the final cut. It is said that sometimes, when a thief was condemned, it was not the guard or priest who performed the amputation. A family member, a brother, a father, a son, that the punishment was made doubly sacred by the hand that delivered it. Blood for blood, betrayal for betrayal. To steal was to shame not just oneself, but one's name, one's lineage, one's house, and so the house answered, with blade, with silence, with tears swallowed beneath linen masks. And when all was done, when the sand turned red and the screams faded into the thick, eternal hush of the tomb, the hand was lifted, wrapped, tagged, returned. Not all graves were looted, not all hands were cut, but those that were still lie there, beneath layers of dust and ritual and forgetting, waiting in the hush between desert winds. You can almost hear them, not voices, not cries, but something smaller, a brushing sound, a shift in the sand, as though something once buried still reaches upward, still aches to steal back what was taken from it. The tombs of Saqqara, though silent, are not still. They breathe through stone mouths, sigh through broken hieroglyphs, murmur through rooms that once echoed with chants and sacrifice. They hold more than bones. They hold judgment, and beneath it all, scattered like seeds beneath a cruel harvest, lie the severed hands, cold, forgotten, faithful only to the law that birthed them. They were not just punishment. They were memory, a memory carved in bone, a final act of justice or cruelty or both, a warning that the hand of man may steal, but the hand of the gods will always take back. At the edge of a nameless island, where the Aegean sighs against limestone cliffs and wind scrapes the bones of long-dead olive trees, a voice was once swallowed whole, not by the sea, not by death, but by ink-black, heavy and eternal. They say in the time of the tyrants, when the sun burned the columns of Athens, gold and fear was traded like silver. There were those who spoke truths they were not meant to speak, and for such crimes there was a punishment older than even the myths, crueler than exile, quieter than death, a tongue dipped in ink, a mouth that bled black, a voice condemned not to silence, but to a haunting, blotted whisper that stained the air and vanished like smoke. The ancients tell this not in full stories, but in fragments, in the margins of scrolls, in a smudge beside Herodotus's hand, in the unfinished sentence of a poet whose name has been lost to the tide. The ritual had no name, only aftermath. It began, they say, when a servant whispered too closely in the ear of a tyrant's rival, a warning, a secret, a prophecy. No one remembers what he said, only that the words should never have lived. For that, his tongue was severed not with fire or steel, but cut and stuffed with a black, bitter resin made of iron gall and blood, the same ink used to mark names into state records, the same ink poured into laws, the same ink that could kill a reputation or crown a king. And now that ink lived in his mouth. There are no surviving paintings of it, only the faintest relief. Etched into the base of a ruined temple on Naxos, a man kneeling, mouth open in agony, with something leaking down his chin. Not blood, not water. Something darker, thicker. The image is barely visible, as if the stone itself refused to remember. And perhaps that is the point. This punishment was never about death. It was about erasure. A voice turned into stain. A mind condemned to think in ink. The scholars say there is no proof, no formal decree, no scroll that commands this fate. But, then, why would there be? Tyrants right there, punishments not on paper, but in fear, in rumor, in the trembling of a man's hands before he opens his lips. And yet there are bodies. Beneath the soil outside Athenian lecture halls, beneath ruined stowers and crumbled steps, archaeologists have unearthed graves with strange marks, blunt fractures near the jaw, sliced hyoid bones, dislocated mandibles, no weapons buried nearby, no jewelry, just a body, its throat carved open and the stone around it stained darker than the rest. They say it's decay, they say it's time, but the bones argue otherwise. One grave in particular lies behind what remains of the temple of Hephaestus. The body was curled inward, hands clenched at the neck, the jaw dislocated, and in the soil beside it, a lump of hardened residue iron, tannin, and gallnut traces, ink, not from parchment, not spilled, but sealed in something once living, as if the tongue had absorbed it in death and carried it across centuries, a mouth buried with a final message that no one will ever read. And so the tale persists. The punishment for betrayal, for speaking when silence was survival, a tongue dipped in ink and sealed behind lips that could never form sound again. The condemned were paraded in silence through crowded markets, their mouths stitched shut with linen soaked in wine, their jaws bound. They were placed before the people not as martyrs, but as warnings, eyes wild, throats pulsing with mute fury. They were left to stand beneath the Acropolis sun until the cloth decayed and their ink-blackened mouths were visible once more. No one dared look too long. Some say they were released, allowed to live, allowed to walk the agora, wordless, reminders of the price of speech. Others say they were sacrificed, their blood mixed with wax to seal tyrannical proclamations, their mutilated voices the final signature on laws that outlawed truth. It was not about silencing the guilty. It was about infecting the air with fear, so even the innocent would learn to swallow their words. In quiet hours, they say, the inked ones would gather near the hills, beneath fig trees or among the ruins of old bathhouses. They could not speak, but they would hum, a low, trembling vibration, like the sound of a jar being sealed. One placed a reed to his throat and wrote on the sand. Another tried to draw his dreams, but the ink always returned, bleeding from his gums, staining his fingertips. So he stopped. He let it pool, let it dry on his skin like armor. And then there are the ones we'll never find, the ones whose bones were buried not with honor, but with bricks sealed into walls, forgotten, only to be found centuries later when a worker's chisel struck something soft beneath plaster and dust, a cavity in the stone, a hollow space that should not have existed, and within it a whisper of ink. Not liquid, not readable, just the idea of it. A silence so thick it bled through time. Now, in the dark hours before dawn, when the wind brushes the shutters and the stars hang low like verdicts in the sky, you might hear it, the scratch of something that tried to speak, the sob of a word that never formed, the ink still wet in the memory of the earth, rising to the surface in dreams. You wake, throat dry, and wonder what it means to speak in a world that punishes. Sound, to carry your voice like a weapon, to know that even ink can wound. They are gone now, the tongue-inked ones, no names, no tombstones, just a legend soaked in shadow and spilled across midnight. But in that shadow there's still something moving, something murmuring behind closed walls, a blot that was once a word that once had meaning, a meaning that once could have changed everything, and that, perhaps, is the deepest fear of all. Not that we will be silenced, but that when we finally speak, the world will look away, that the ink we bled for will vanish before it's ever read. The sun rose red over the Appian Way, not the gentle flush of dawn, but a wash of firelight cast through dust and the scent of rotting flesh. In that pale Roman morning, the road did not sing with traders or the clatter of chariot wheels. It wept. For 60 long miles, the dead hung like broken pendulums, nailed in intervals along the imperial highway. Limbs splayed, torsos stripped, skulls tilted upward toward gods who did not answer. Ravens fluttered from corpse to corpse like priests of a forgotten rite, their wings stained with old blood. Rome did not flinch. This was justice. This was spectacle. This was Rome's voice, not spoken in words, but in silence and empire, proclaiming its will with nails. The crucifixion of the slaves of Spartacus was not a single moment. It was a procession of agony, a chant sung with hammer blows and spears. After the rebellion fell, after the last sword clattered onto the soil of Lucania, 6,000 men were captured, flesh and breath that had dared to defy the eagle. They were not given the mercy of Bator's death. No, they were sentenced to an end drawn out across days. And so they were raised not into heaven, but into warning. Their crosses, spaced like mile markers, turned the Appian Way into a holy road of horror. Travelers journeying south from Rome would meet them first as shadows, then shapes, then bodies itch, slack-jawed, sun-cracked and swaying in wind. Some wore chains still fastened at the wrist. Some had been stripped bare by Roman guards, others by birds. Nails pierced heel bones, shins shattered to quicken death, arms dislocated into cruciforms no god had ever designed. Some died quickly, most did not. Death here came in thirst, in fever, in the slow collapse of lungs pressed by their own weight. There were no cries, no last speeches, only breathless mouths and swollen tongues that made of silence a terrible sermon. The Romans believed crucifixion was the most shameful death. It was punishment for the lowliest slaves, brigands, foreigners. It stripped not only the body, but the name, the face, the meaning. To be crucified was to vanish publicly, not buried, not burned, just displayed until the bones fell like fruit. The body became a banner not of the person, but of power's cruelty. And so it was not done in hidden groves or quiet cliffs. It was done here on the Appian Way, the road that stretched to Brindisi, the road of armies, of senators, of travelers returning home. All would see dot, and they did see dot. Scrolls tell us the soldiers laughed, that the centurions made sport of who lasted longest, that parents covered their children's eyes, or didn't, that the merchants kept walking, that the wheels of carts cracked bones already fallen from the wood, that for days the The smell clung to the olive groves nearby, to the robes of the nobility, to the air itself. Rome became scented with rebellion's end. The crucifixions began at Capua and ended near the gates of the city. They called it a punishment, but punishment requires justice. This was a messenger carving into time itself. This was what became of those who raised arms not to conquer, but to be free. Spartacus, though never captured, had his spirit crucified 6,000 times. The earth beneath the road remembers. Archaeologists have found traces the ghost of wood in compacted soil, nails rusted into heel bones, shards of splintered support beams. No names, only bones with stories choked inside them. In a museum, one such skeleton lies behind glass, a nail driven sideways through the ankle joint, precisely aimed to prevent escape but prolong the torment. You can stand before it, safe and distant, and still hear the echo of the scream that never stopped. It is said the Appian Way was silent. During those days, the usual chatter of peddlers and the whip-crack of traffic gave way to something deeper, a reverent horror. People hurried past the crosses as one passes gravestones, but these were not graves. There were no prayers, no incense, only sun and stench and the slow inevitability of decay. The road itself became a ritual of passage through death, framed in wood and blood. The silence was not from respect, it was fear. Rome's kind of silence done. Time, the bodies fell. Rain loosened the bindings. Birds plucked away the faces. The sun split rib cages like overripe fruit. And eventually, what was once man became dust, and the road returned to function. But the stain lingered. For centuries, it was whispered that no olive tree grew well near those miles, that travellers still felt eyes upon them, even when the road seemed empty, that on windless days one might still hear the creak of wood or the rustle of a rope too old to still be swaying. And Rome survived. It always did. It built upon its silence. It paved over its screams. It gilded its forums and marble steps, while the bones of the crucified dissolved into memory. They did not write their names in the Senate. They do not appear in the scrolls of victory, but still they speak those 6,000 bodies. They speak with their absence, with the echo left behind. What power fears most is not rebellion, but memory, and yet memory always returns, even now when one walks the Appian Way at dusk. There is a hush that descends as shadows lengthen. The stones seem older, the dust thicker, and in that quiet, if you stop and listen, not with ears, but with something older, you may feel it, a breathlessness, a hush filled with eyes and nails and outstretched hands. The crucified do not scream anymore, but they are not silent. They have become the road in the stillness of ancient dawn. When the sky hung pale and breathless over the yellowed mountains of Chin, punishment was not whispered, was carved, not in stone, but into flesh, into the faces of those who displeased emperors, who defied mandates written in the blood of their ancestors. There was no need for execution when shame could live longer than death. And so, the silence of mutilation became the empire's loudest warning. They called it the 5 punishments, a name too neat, too delicate for what it meant. First came tattooing black marks pressed into foreheads, cheeks, and jaws, an ink that whispered criminal to all who passed. Then the slicing of noses, the sawing of limbs, the cutting of flesh from bone, the carving of crime into the body. To be punished was not merely to suffer, it was to become the message. In the era of the Chin, where jade figurines guarded emperors' tombs, and roads stretched like veins across the empire's chest. The body became law's parchment. To rebel was to forfeit your face. To steal was to stain your skin. And to betray, even with a whisper, was to lose what defines you as human. A nose, a finger, a name. These were not hidden tortures performed in shadow. They were public declarations. Towns gathered to witness the mutilation of the shamed. Children watched their fathers brought to the center of the village, held down and carved like offerings to the gods of order. The blade was clean, the screams brief, but the silence after endless Bronze Age tombs scattered across modern-day China still bear traces of this ritual cruelty. Skulls uncovered with clean shears at the nose bridge, mandibles fractured with precise, deliberate pressure. Bones where flesh once covered disfigurement now revealed themselves under archaeologists' brushes, pale and cracked. There is no blood left, no echo of the crime. Only the aftermath of justice scars turned to dust in one tomb. Nestled beneath what once may have been a military outpost, archaeologists found a burial unlike the rest. A skeleton lay curled upon itself, as if attempting to hide from centuries. The skull, elegant in its proportions, bore a clean void where the nose had once been. No jewelry, no tokens of honor, just silence. And yet, someone had placed a small bronze mirror near the body's side, as if the deceased were meant to confront their own broken reflection. Again and again, beyond death, ancient legal texts recovered from bamboo strips, tightly wound and inked in slanted chin script, outline the 5 punishments like commandments: the stripping of fingernails, the carving of tattoos, the shearing of genitals. Each crime its price, each soul its transformation. A pickpocket might lose their hand, a soldier who deserted his tongue and ears. And yet some transgressors were not killed. They were marked, paraded, and left to live. Why? Perhaps it was mercy in a kingdom ruled by severity. Or perhaps, more chilling still, it was spectacle, a living monument to fear. For what warns louder than a man with no nose, no ear, no voice, still walking, still breathing, his every step a sermon to obedience? The cities were alive with faces undone. Markets bustled with men and women marked by ink, noses replaced by scars, eyes dulled by pain. They were not shunned, they were reminders, living statues of the law. You could not plead ignorance when the punishment walked beside you at night, beneath the lantern glow and murmuring wind. These mutilated figures would disappear into side alleys, temples, and silence. There are tales whispered in shadow about gatherings of the marked, secret societies formed of those stripped of status, banding together to form a fellowship of the forgotten. They communicated in symbols, in marks carved on trees and stone. They gave each other new names, ones that could not be taken in the Book of Han. There is a strange passage. A man without a face stood before the magistrate and told no lies. He had none left to offer. Scholars dismissed it as poetic, fiction, but perhaps it was something else. A memory of a practice so cruel, so woven into the empire's bones that it became myth. Over time, the 5 punishments were reformed. Less blood, fewer blades. Empires shifted, dynasties rose and fell, and mutilation lost favor. But bones do not forget. Beneath modern highways, temples, and rivers, the punished remain. Nose-broken skulls curled in fetal peace, their crimes long erased. Their bodies still speak, not in pain, but in the stillness of their loss. You may pass by one of these sites and feel something cold press at your chest, a whisper you can't place, a wrongness in the air. That is history's breath. That is the hush of the silenced. They do not scream, they do not beg. They lie with their wounds turned to dust and their secrets sealed in soil. And still, in dreams, they walk. A procession of broken faces under moonlight, inked and silent. Eyes like empty wells, noses like forgotten bridges, lips cracked and mute. Not forgotten, only unspoken, not forgiven. Only buried in the stillness between midnight and morning. If you listen closely beneath the wind, the rustle of leaves, the soft breath of sleep, you may hear the echo of a face that once was whole. Beneath the red hush of dawn, where the mist rises from the stone like smoke from a sleeping god's mouth, a temple stands, its silhouette black and jagged cuts into the bleeding sky, high above the sacred lake. Here the wind is silent, even the birds hold their breath. All life seems to pause, watching, remembering. For in these heights, hearts once beat not for love, but for fire. And their rhythms were not silenced by time, but torn from the chest, in a single, holy scream. The city was called Tenochtitlan Jewel of the Valley of Mexico. A crown placed on water, dreamed into being by an eagle clutching a serpent. Its streets were carved with obsidian, its canals gliding with canoes like quiet ghosts, and at its heart the Templo Mayor, a mountain of stone dedicated to the sun and its hunger. The sun did not rise alone in this world. It demanded tribute, and not with coin, with blood. The air would thicken long before the sacrifice. The drums deep and slow would start before the sun had broken over the horizon. Citizens gathered in silence, not as audience, but as witnesses. The city was not afraid of what came next. Fear was not permitted here, only reverence, only stillness. For the priests were preparing, bare-chested, white-robed, daubed in soot and sacrificial red. They climbed the steep stairs of the pyramid like men ascending into the throat of a god. The victim followed behind, painted in sacred chalk, adorned with feathers that would flutter even after death. Bound, but not struggling. For many, it was an honor. To die here meant to rise again with the sun, to ride in its chariot across the heavens. To fall to the obsidian blade was not to be destroyed, but to be devoured, exalted, returned to the sky. When the priest raised the knife, it was not with anger, it was with awe. The obsidian was blacker than night and sharper than memory. It did not cut like steel, it whispered through flesh. One motion, no hesitation. The chest was opened like a blooming flower, and from within the heart still warm, still pulsing was. Lifted to the sky, held aloft, it beat once, twice, then stilled. Some say the gods fed on that rhythm, that the sun would falter if it was not fed. Others say the heart did not beat for the gods, but for the people watching. A reminder that life is brief, that time is blood, that the cycle of day and night demands a price. The body was rolled down the temple steps. Slack, feathers, torn its life, poured into the stone. And below, in the ceremonial courtyards, priests arranged the bones of the dead, not discarded, but kept preserved in shrines, buried in layers, as if the city itself rested on a bed of human sacrifice. And perhaps it did. When the Spaniards came, they spoke of the rituals with horror. They saw savagery, not sanctity. They saw blood, not belief, and yet even they could not look away. One wrote of how the heart, once severed, danced in the priests, hand for a breath longer. Another wrote of the scent of flowers and fire and iron in the air, of a silence that lingered longer than death. Modern hands have unearthed what ancient ones buried. In the soil of Tlatelolco, archaeologists found thousands of ribs perforated by ritual, obsidian blades still gleaming, though dulled by time, offering pots cracked with dried blood, skulls lined in rose trophies or altars, no one knows. Some were children, some were warriors, all were chosen. And what did they believe in those last moments? Did they see the sun? Did they feel the gods drawing near? Or did they stare up at the crimson sky and wonder what lay beyond the fire? We cannot ask them. The hearts are gone. The echoes remain. The stones of Tenochtitlan still hum with memory, though the Spanish tore down temples and built cathedrals. In their place, though they flooded canals and buried altars, the earth remembers. The bones lie beneath the marketplaces. The sacred knives sleep beneath the cobblestones. And when the wind shifts just right, when the light slants at dawn, the shadow of the pyramid rises again. There are no more sacrifices. The gods are quiet now, but the rhythm they fed upon the pulsing silence of a torn heart. The scream held in the throat of the earth still lingers. It is not loud. It is not heard in words. It is the silence in the breath before sunrise. It is the beat of absence in a city that once traded hearts for light. It is the stillness that lives in us all. The knowing that one day the sun will ask again. It begins, not with a scream, but with the sizzle of betrayal meeting flame. Beneath the shadowed arches of a medieval fortress, where wind moaned through iron slats and the air reeked of ash and sweat, there stood a cauldron, not the kind used for soup, or stews, or feast-day broth, but a cauldron made for punishment, wide-bellied, iron-lipped, blackened from years of fire-fed fury. Its belly, when filled, held not meat or marrow, but pitch tar, thick as sign, heated until it bubbled like a beast roused from sleep. They say it was in the days of Emperor Frederick, Barbarossa, when law was iron and crime was fire. Verona, proud and rich in silk and coin, feared not the sword but the pen, not the warrior but the whisperer. Counterfeiters and poisoners, those who corrupted not the body but the soul of trust, were judged the most vile. These were not men who stole with knives, but those who altered truths, who sold lies dressed as silver. The punishment for such deceit was slow. The condemned were not beheaded, nor hung like thieves. They were cooked, dash alive, pictured a square. Before the castle, a place where crows circled like black memories and cobblestones glistened with oil. A wooden scaffold stood nearby, not for hanging, but for display. Villagers gathered not out of bloodlust, but out of fear, their faces pale with the knowledge that lies too easily worn might one day wear them down. The condemned, often bound in coarse rope, were led to the cauldron. Some sobbed, some screamed. Prayers, some were silent, as if already halfway into death's embrace. The priests spoke not of mercy, only of justice. The pitch was stirred with iron rods, its fumes rising like ghosts, clinging to the nostrils, the skin, the soul. And then they were lowered, not dropped, lowered, slowly, feet first, so that every inch of flesh could reckon with what it meant to cheat the world. The liquid hissed as skin touched its surface. The sound was like rain on firewood, gentle, then fierce. Boils rose, flesh peeled, nerves lit like lanterns beneath. The skin, some died quickly, others thrashed, their eyes wide and mouths agape in soundless horror. The screams, they say, didn't always make it to the ears. The pitch swallowed them, thick and tarry and final, and still the people watched. Children clung to mothers, old men spat, priests crossed themselves. The cauldron boiled on, patient and faithful in its service. No bones remain. The cauldrons excavated centuries later beneath castle kitchens and stone courtyards were empty. Blackened, yes. Scarred by heat, yes. But no femur, no rib, no skull left behind. Perhaps the bodies were removed in secret, buried far beyond the gates. Or perhaps the pitch took everything, even the bones, melting them into forgetfulness. The archaeologists scratched their heads. The chroniclers whispered, but the cauldrons, they said nothing. One was found tucked beneath the ruins of a butcher's stall, another beneath a monastery. In both, the inner walls were glazed with resin, as if the fire had licked them for years. Scratches on the iron hinted at hands, fingernails, clawing not for mercy but for escape. They never made it out. Some believed this punishment was more than just a sit with symbol. Fraud cooked in its own lie, deceit boiled into truth. If you forged a coin, you were melted like one. If you poisoned a goblet, your flesh would bubble like the brew. A man's crime mirrored in his death, as though morality itself wore iron gloves. And still, silence. The record's name, no victims, only titles. A merchant of Milan, a woman found with tinctures of mercury, a scribe who altered the city's seal. No names, no graves, just the heat, just the pitch, just the memory. Some said the emperor himself never watched, that he ordered the deaths from afar, unwilling to soil his eyes with what his justice demanded. Others say he stood in the shadows, face veiled, watching the steam rise like incense, pondering whether a lie could ever truly be burned away. But what lies are these, left for us in history's wake? We speak of boiling cauldrons as if they were symbols, as if the bodies that once thrashed within were fictions or shadows. Yet beneath the stones, the scorch marks remain. In the silence of ancient kitchens, soot lingers in corners where nothing has burned for centuries. And still, if you listen at night, near those forgotten ruins, you might hear something. Not a scream, not a cry, just the faint crackle of something. Bubbling, something wrong being undone. We live in a world where lies often go unseen. But once, in the depths of Verona, they were made visible in flesh, in fire, in Tardot, and the cauldrons waited silent, eternal, waiting still, beneath the gold street sky of the Valley of Mexico, where the dawn comes quietly but never gently. There once stood a plaza wide as the breath of a god. In the early hush of the day, it held no merchants, no music, no laughter, only dust and the quiet shuffle of bound feet. The stones there remembered everything. They remembered the blood soaked into their grains. They remembered the soft, breaking cries. They remembered the sound of knees cracking like split wood. The city was Tenochtitlan, jewel of the Aztecs, seat of power and hunger. It was a city built not only on canals and pyramids, but on debt owed to rulers, to ancestors, to gods whose names were carved into obsidian and sung like thunder in the temples. Debt was sacred. But those who could not repay in goods, in gold, in grain, were made to repay in flesh. Flesh and bone and silenced in the codices, painted by trembling hands. Long after the fact, the condemned are shown kneeling, not praying, not resisting, just kneeling. Their eyes wide as suns, their legs lashed tightly at the ankles, knees braced for what would come. The priests wore red, always red, not only for the ceremony, but because the color hid the splatter. One by one, the debtors were brought forward, carried if they refused to walk, dragged if they collapsed. Some cried out. Others bit their lips until they bled, preferring that pain to the humiliation of begging. But all were brought to the stones, and all were made to kneel. Then came the breaking. It wasn't a hammer, not always. Sometimes it was a staff, heavy with carved glyphs. Sometimes it was a weight dropped from above. But most often it was the priest himself, raising a stone with both hands, his face blank with the quiet knowledge of duty, and bringing it down like a god smiting the earth. The crack of femur against force echoed through the plaza, louder than a scream. But screams came anyway, always that the limbs didn't shatter like glass. They bent, warped, bowed under pressure, torn from within. Sometimes they snapped completely, and the leg twisted into an impossible shape, like a branch after a storm. Sometimes they only fractured, but that was worse, the damage deeper, more insidious, harder to heal. The broken were not killed, not yet. Some would be stoned afterward, buried under the very stones that broke them. Others were left to crawl, away, dragging ruined legs behind them, becoming shadows in the alleyways of the city. They were reminders, moving relics of what happens when one cannot pay. Archaeologists, centuries later, would find femurs healed at grotesque angles, the bones of men who somehow survived the ritual of pain, men who lived long enough to harden into statues of suffering. These bones were wide-legged in their agony, bowed like beasts forced to kneel too long. Some had died alone in corners. Others were buried in shallow graves with tokens clutched in their still-bent hands, offerings, perhaps for a better debt in the next world. But why the knees? Why not the hand that stole or the mouth that lied? Because the knees are where pride lives. The knees are where men stand tall. And to break the knee is to make a man forever humble, forever less than upright. It was not just punishment, it was transformation. A proud man becomes a crawling creature, a debtor becomes dust. The Aztecs believed in cycles of the sun, of the heart, of the soul's journey beyond death. They believed that what was broken here could be whole elsewhere, if the gods willed it. But first, the debt must be acknowledged, not just in words, but in screams. In silence afterward, those condemned might once have been farmers, artisans, merchants whose fortunes turned sour. Perhaps they borrowed maize for planting and could not return it. Perhaps they gambled. Perhaps they simply lived in a world where misfortune itself was a sin. The emperor was generous, but the empire did not forget. The plaza remembered when the ceremony was done, when the sun had risen high enough to cast sharp shadows from the broken forms. The priests would leave. The crowd would disperse. Sometimes the families would come, silent, ashamed. Other times, no one came, and the wind did the burying. The plaza would remain still. The stones, warm with sunlight and blood, would cool again by nightfall. No voice cried out then, only the whisper of dust against stone, only the memory of weight, and always the broken silence of debt repaid in agony. Now, centuries later, tourists walk over plazas where such pain once lived. They wear sandals, they laugh, they take photos. But if you listen closely, beneath the hum of the city, you might still hear the soft drag of a leg that never healed. The sigh of stone remembering weight, for the gods may have eaten their fill. The emperors may have vanished, but the plaza remembers. The debt was paid, the bones broken, the rhythm eternal, and ever absent. They brought them down into the stone belly of the monastery at dawnwine. The light was soft, still tinged with violet, and the world above had not yet stirred. Beneath sanctified walls and carved arches, below altars kissed by incense and candlelight, the silence was not holy but hollow. It waited, dense and unmoving, between walls that had heard too many things no man should ever speak aloud. Here. In the crypts beneath Spain's cloisters, the Inquisition had perfected its rituals, not the rituals of prayer, but of sacred and twisted rites they believed could burn truth from the soul as flame sears parchment. The condemned were not always heretics. Sometimes they were merely inconvenient. A rumor passed too carelessly, a dream recounted to the wrong ear, a prayer whispered in the wrong language. Names were spoken by others trying to escape their own agony, and so the noose travelled like wildfire. You did not have to sinew, only had to be named. The strappado was not a machine of madness, but of precision, a rope, a pulley, and silence. Simplicity forged for horror. The wrists were bound behind the back, elbows pulled close, until bone groaned beneath muscle. Then the body was hoisted from the earth not high, just enough for the toes to lose memory of the floor. And then came the fall, sudden, absolute. The rope stopped short. Flesh kept falling, shoulders cracked like splintering branches, sinew tore in unseen spirals, the body contorted in its own scream. But the chamber was quiet. Confession did not come in screams, but in weeping. And finally, in words. The inquisitors stood still, their robes unmoved by the air. They bore no joy in their task, or so they claimed. But it is difficult to tell where discipline ends and cruelty begins. When pain is pressed into parchment and catalogued with careful, God-fearing ink, they recorded confessions in perfect Latin. Script, notations clean, measured, correct. Aereticus confessus heretic confessed. Dixet nomina liorum. He named others. The words were inked as though they described weather or tide, or the passing of seasons. But the bodies tell another tale. Archaeologists uncovered scraps beneath the soil, bits of iron rings, splintered wood smoothed from too many writhing bodies, and bones, always the bones, shoulders mostly, some shattered, some healed wrong, as though the body had been left to survive its own wreckage. Socket bones calcified at crooked angles, as if they had never quite forgiven what was done to them. Some shoulders healed, some did not. One man, unnamed, buried in haste beneath a chapel floor, had both arms fused in unnatural curvature. The ligaments had never realigned. He had lived, but not well. There is something cruel in a healed fracture. It speaks of a world that continued, a life dragged on after the pain, that man may have walked again, but his arms would never again lift. In prayer, the air in those chambers still holds its breath. In the places where the rope once swung, even silence seems reluctant. The sound of that drop, brief, brutal, and final, echoed, not in thunder, but in the soft crunch of faith breaking under pressure. And yet, there is something else, a record. In a monastic archive, a brief entry, almost erased by time. It speaks of a man who never confessed. His body gave before his soul did, his shoulder torn from the joint. Blood dripped to the flagstones, and still he would not name others. The inquisitor wrote, in frustrated hand, mortius anti confessioning, dead before confession. What was his name? The record does not say. Perhaps they thought he had won something in death, and so erased him to make sure it stayed buried. But bone remembers, and stone remembers, and silence, most of all, remembers. There is a legend, no more than a whisper, passed between archivists and old monks with shaking hands. It says that sometimes, in the oldest monasteries of Spain, the bells toll once at midnight, when no hand has pulled the rope, a single chime. For the one who never confessed, what does it mean to confess? In the hands of the Inquisition, it was not truth, but surrender. You confessed not to be believed, but to be broken. And if you did not bend, they would make you brittle until you snapped. They told themselves they were saving souls. That pain opened the mouth of the damned. That confession was the bomb for heresy. But in the end, all that remains are bones. Bones twisted with purpose. Bones that no longer carry burdens, but still speak in their own way. So listen, not with ears, but with quiet, in the hush of a stone corridor, in the cold breath of a cloistered night, in the groan of an old wooden beam high in the rafters. Listen to the things that were never spoken, to the silence between the words, to the creak of rope above the void. It begins with wind, dry, relentless, dragging the dust like a funeral shroud across the empty plains of the steppe. There are no trees here to weep, no cloisters to echo prayer, only the bones of the earth, brittle and scorched, where secrets are buried deeper than roots. Beneath the vast and pitiless sky of Mongolia, history does not whisper, it bleeds slowly into the silence. And somewhere in that silence, the sound of a cup tilting, in the time of Genghis Khan, when empires rode like thunder and breath was measured by the loyalty it carried. Betrayal was not just a crime, it was a wound in the world. The great Khan, feared and revered, demanded obedience not only from his enemies, but from his blood, his generals, his brothers. And so the traitor's end was crafted not in fire, not in blade, but in ritual. Cold, quiet, and irrevocable. They called it the silent death. The traitor was brought before the Khan, sometimes in a grand yacht, lit with flickering oil lamps that threw shadows like spirits on the walls. Sometimes in the open, under the same eternal sky they had once sworn loyalty beneath. And always, always, the same object rested on a cloth. Before them a cup, carved of silver or stone, or sometimes lacquered wood. A vessel not for wine, but for reckoning. The poison was bitter, mixed with herbs that stained the tongue black and turned the blood to silence. Arsenic, it is believed, its traces found centuries later inside the dark hollows of ancient graves. In Karakoram, the chemical footprint still lingering in the grains of the cup, as if the betrayal refused to fade. The traitor would kneel. There were no bonds, no screaming interrogators, no public spectacle, only the Khan's gaze, steady as judgment. Only the cup, waiting to drink, was to accept fate. It was the last obedience, the final bow to the empire they had once betrayed. Refusal meant shame, dishonor, and death, not by drink, but by blade or humiliation. But those who drank, the traitors who chose silence, were granted a burial, not one of reverence, but of ceremony. Wrapped in wool or silk, their body was laid to rest with the cup beside them, a bitter chalice now emptied of its cruel gift. The Mongols believed in signs, omens, in the flight of birds, in the whirl of smoke, in the behavior of horses. But in this death there was no need for divination. The meaning was sharp and simple. Silence is loyalty's grave. It was not always generals or high officials. Sometimes it was a brother. Sometimes it was a beloved friend who had ridden beside. the Khan in countless battles. It did not matter. The law was absolute. And so the betrayal was witnessed not only by the living, but by the ancestors, by the spirits of the plain who drifted through the grass like ghosts waiting for stories. Imagine the moment. The Khan sits unmoved, a statue carved from wind and war. The cup is lifted, trembling hands brushing the rim. The traitor drinks, slowly. No rush, no final speech. Only the dry taste of earth and metal and regret. A pause. A shallow breath. A stiffening of the spine. The first tightening in the chest. The pain sudden, sharp. A cough that carries no sound. Then collapse. Sand blown into the folds of their cloak. Eyes open to the sky one last time. Nothing else, no weeping, no outcry, no tomb built to honor them. And yet, centuries later, archaeologists would find them those who drank the cup. They lie alone in shallow graves, some clutching the cups that killed them. Traces of arsenic still clinging to the vessel like a memory unwilling to dissolve. There are no names inscribed, no words carved in stone, but their bones tell the story, unbroken, unblemished, undisturbed, except for death. And so the mystery lingers. Why this manner of death? Why a cup instead of a sword? Perhaps the Khan believed in mercy. Perhaps he believed that to give the traitor a choice Yvonne, one poisoned, was to remind the living that loyalty must come freely, or not, at all. Or perhaps the silence of the poison was the point. It did not cry out, it did not beg. It ended not just the traitor, but the noise of treachery itself. There is an intimacy in poison. The traitor must lift the cup with their own hand, must seal their own ending. It is a private death, a death chosen, and in choosing it, they give one last service to the empire they betrayed. They remove themselves. Tonight, the wind still roams the steppe, the same wind that once brushed against the Khan's robes, the same wind that cooled the sweat of the dying. The yurt is long gone, the armies are dust, but the ritual remains. In the mind, in the myth, in the haunted silence that follows the taste of betrayal, somewhere in a forgotten field of Karakoram, a cup lies buried beside its last drinker, its poison long dried. But if you hold it to your lips, if you close your eyes, you might still taste the ghost of arsenic. You might still hear the faint echo of a vow broken. And in that stillness, the Mongol wind carries one final truth. Silence has weight. And a traitor's silence weighs more than any scream ever could. In the faint silver hour before dawn, when even wolves hesitate to howl and the winds coil like breathless prayers around the eaves of forgotten homes, the village gates of old Balkan Hill stood guard beneath flickering torchlight. Silence gathered there, not the silence of peace, but the kind that follows screaming, where something sacred has been taken and something shameful displayed. High above the wooden crossbeams, nailed through with rusted spikes and stringy twine, were ears, human ears, flattened, shriveled, scorched black by flame and time. They hung like medals in the cruel theatre of loyalty, each one a vow broken, a word overheard, a secret told to the wrong soul in the wrong century. The village itself is gone now, a name dissolved in centuries of rain, war, and forgetfulness. But the gates remained for longer than they should have, long enough for stone-choked roots to press up through the wells, for the wind to remember the smell of burning cartilage and old iron, long enough for bones to be found nearby, brittle, and whispering beneath the moss, skulls missing their ears, Mastoid bones carved with the brutal indifference of routine, each a silent echo of punishment rendered in torchlit square under the unblinking gaze of a crowned god. It was under the rule of the medieval Serbian king Stefan Dusan, Euros, the weak, and the iron-fisted lords who came before and after that. Such punishments were more than mere vengeance. They were spectacle, edict, religion. Treason and heresy were not sins of thought. They were crimes of tongue and earwords overheard, doubts whispered in the wrong chapel, letters burned too slowly. An ear severed meant more than pain. It was a signal to the rest. We are always listening. Monks chronicled the tolling of bells. At dusk, when the condemned were dragged barefoot through the village, their faces dripped with soot and spit, shoulders bruised from lashings. At the gates, a fire was lit in a shallow iron bowl. The blade was small, curved, hot. The ear, once tender with childhood whispers and mother's lullabies, was gripped and pulled. No anesthetic, just a prayer mocking or earnest before the cartilage crackled and was thrown to the flame. Then, while still steaming, it was nailed up. The bell rang again. A priest muttered something about redemption, and the villagers went back to their supper. But the ones who remained behind the mutilated were never quite whole again. In many cases, they were not executed afterward. That would have been too clean. Instead, they were marked, known, whispered about. Children would point. Old women would cross themselves. Some wore hoods for the rest of their lives. Others joined monasteries, seeking silence deeper than pain. A few disappeared into the forests, their blood mingling with the wolves. And there were those who went mad, hearing voices only in the side that no longer had an ear, one skull unearthed. In the shadow of Mount Zlata bore not one, but 3 cuts to the right side of its head. The archaeologist who brushed it clean said the markings were too precise for animal damage, too deliberate for accident. The mastoid process had been notched, with something serrated, saw-like, and nearby lay fragments of iron nails, rusted, crooked, and old as dust. There were no tools for healing in that grave. No charms, only broken teeth and ash. Someone had wanted this silence remembered. Legends lingered long after the gates fell. They told of a ghost with no ears who wandered the roads between monasteries, unable to hear the chants of monks or the moaning of winter winds. It was said he could not be cursed because he could not hear the spell. It was said he wept not from pain, but from being forgotten by even the sound of his own name. And still, the earth beneath those villages refused to keep secrets. In some dig sites, dozens of ears were found buried in heaps, separate from any body, no names, no records, just a mound of listening flesh that had heard too much. Sometimes a gold coin would be buried with the pile, perhaps an offering, perhaps a bribe to the saints who still judged in silence. It is said that a few monks refused to walk the gate path after dark, that they swore the nailed ears whispered in the wind, that when the firelight hit the old would just right, the cartilage gleamed like wet opal, blinking at the living. The punishment of the ear was, in many ways, the cruelest mercy. It allowed the body to live and the shame to grow. And shame is a slow, eternal burn. It changes a man's gait, his breath, the tilt of his head. In a world where oaths were sacred and gossip fatal, the ear became the mark of betrayal. And the traitor became both witness and warning his own body, a sermon preached without words. Now, centuries later, the gates are gone. The bells rusted into silence. the torches long since swallowed by ivy and earth. But if you walk those woods, when the fog hangs low and the moon forgets to shine, some say you can still hear them, not screams, not voices, but the crack of cartilage, soft and wet, and the ring of a nail driving through what used to be a man's last tether to the world. And, in that quiet, you may remember that not all silence is peace, that some things were never meant to be heard, and that even now the wind keeps secrets nailed to gates that no longer stand, under a rose-gold dusk, where the air shimmers like silk over sandstone. The water gardens of the Rajput courts exhaled their secrets, somewhere in the twilight between punishment and ritual, between death and purification. There was the sound of gurgling fountains and the faint rustle of chains. It was not the kind of death that came with swords or fire, but one drawn from the slow grace of elephants and the quiet cruelty of dripping water. Here, in the palatial enclosures where peacocks wept in their feathers and marble halls echoed with ghostly ankle bells, the Mughal and Rajput dynasties played a game far older than any war, one of justice, spectacle, and sanctified violence. For those who betrayed the court, who whispered lies into the ears of princes or poisoned loyalty with greed, there was no simple hanging or beheading. No, they were offered to the elephants, not to be crushed, but to be washed. The great elephants of the court, painted in lotus designs, their tusks capped in gold, were trained not merely for battle or parade, but for punishment. They knew the rituals, they remembered the cries, and in the garden of fountains, those sacred pools fed by copper veins through the earth, they became instruments of slow, drowning judgment. Bound by the wrist and ankles, the accused were laid at the elephant's feet. The animals did not crush them. Instead, they dipped their trunks into the fountain pools, pulled the water into their mouths, and with unnatural gentleness began to drench the traitors. Not once, not twice, but again and again, a rhythm as old as the monsoon. Each blast of water struck the body like a monk's whip into the face, the chest, the ribs, until coughing replaced screaming and the lungs pleaded silently for breath. Sometimes it was mercy. The ones who confessed early were spared the prolonged torment, but sometimes the water was patient, and the elephants, too. They could go on for hours, soaking the prisoner, waiting between sprays like priests pausing in a chant. The cruelty was not in haste, it was in repetition, in the fact that no hand touched the condemned, only the animal, the water, and the weight of betrayal. And when death finally took them, whether by shattered ribs, drowned lungs, or exhaustion, the body was not discarded. It was lifted, carried, still dripping, by the same elephant that delivered the punishment, and brought to the center of the garden, to the great baptismal pool. There, beneath the moonlight, priests whispered over the corpse, a ritual cleansing, not for forgiveness, but for containment, to wash the soul, not free it, to keep it from infecting the earth with the rot of its betrayal. And in the water it sank, wrapped in silk. Its final breath long vanished into the humid air. Archaeologists digging near these old courts in Rajasthan speak of bones, human and elephant, found fused together in layers of clay and blood. Some show signs of impact fractures along the sternum. Others bear strange residue along the skin, facing side traces of something once soft and human, now only a stain. The elephant bones are older, yet they too are not untouched. Faint, blackened lines suggest heat, not from cremation, but from ritual burns, ceremonial markings made after death. Perhaps even the elephants were mourned, or punished for witnessing too much. No record tells us the names of those who died this way. The Mongol chronicles speak only in fragments. The man who whispered under the banyan tree, or the servant who gave silver to the wrong son. Their identities were washed away with their guilt, just as the fountains once washed away their blood. And what of the water? Some believe the fountains were sacred before they were cruel, that they were once used for cleansing brides or blessing new kings. To have died there was to corrupt them, which is why, after each execution, the fountains would be emptied, scrubbed by priests, left dry for days, as if the garden itself needed to forget. Still, some say, on certain nights, when the air is thick with jasmine and the moon sits low, you can hear the spray of water though no fountain runs, a rhythm like a slow heartbeat. Follow it, and you may find a garden half buried, overgrown, stone basins cracked open like broken ribs, and in the stillness, bones, bones and silence, silence except for the faint, impossible sound of an elephant's sigh. The forest held its breath, somewhere beyond the reach of birdsong. Beneath a twilight veil of vapor and incense, the trees stood like shadowed witnesses, tall, patient, unblinking. The silence there was not silence at all, it was the echo of lungs once full of smoke and fire, of screams swallowed by vines, of hearts thudding in their final rhythms against sacred stone. The jungle, in its cruel gentleness, never forgets. It drinks the last breath of every soul offered to it, and under the reign of the Aztec Empire, that breath was often drawn with rope-soaked, stiffened, sacred and laced with the sting of chili and the burn of judgment. It was not death they sought, not at first. No, the priests of the sun, cloaked in feathers and fire, were keepers of balance. To them, every scream was a song, every gasp a plea, and every death a bargain. Their altars were not merely execution stones, they were thresholds, between sin and sky, between the mortal and the gods, in the shadowed courtyard of a temple half swallowed by jungle now. There once stood a stone basin. At night its waters shimmered with obsidian calm, reflecting the stars as if heaven had spilled and pooled there. But that water clear to the eye held ghostlier ingredients, crushed chili pods, red as arterial blood, dissolved in ceremonial oils. The mixture was thick, sticky, clinging to the priest's fingers like guilt. From that basin, the sacred cords were drawn. Cotton ropes, spun by virgin hands, left to steep for 7 sunrises. They hardened slightly, tightened like the resolve of the divine. When pulled tight across a throat, they didn't simply close the windpipe. They painted the path to Mictlan, the Aztec underworld, with fire. The condemned were not chosen lightly. Heresy, betrayal, sorcery crimes that threatened the spiritual scaffolding of the empire. Not all who died in this manner were enemies of the state. Some were warriors who had dishonored ritual combat. Some were nobles who plotted with shadows. And some were lovers who whispered the wrong names in the wrong ears. Each bound soul was led barefoot through the ceremonial path lined with obsidian shards. Every step was a bleeding confession. The ritual began at dusk when the jaguars stirred. The high priest, masked in turquoise and crowned with plumes of red macaw, would raise the rope to the heavens. A chant would fall from the temple steps, low and haunting, not quite melody, not quite mourning. The victim knelt, or was forced to, their neck bowed like a stem snapped by wind. The rope, soaked to saturation, would loop around once, then again, then came the pull. It wasn't swift. It wasn't kind. The chili paste did its work, first entering through cracked lips, flaring nostrils, a burning river down the throat. Each cough brought agony deeper. When the final pressure came, it was as if the lungs themselves had caught fire. No scream emerged, only tremors, only the shaking of a soul trying to leap out of a cage of ribs. Bones found centuries later, under layers of volcanic ash and temple ruin, bear the whisper of this agony. Vertebrae pinched, crushed inward, cartilage twisted, warped by unnatural tension. Around some necks, the remnants of rope still clung like accusing fingers. In others, blackened soot traced the interior of what was once breath. The Aztecs called it purification. They believed the chili was more than a fruit, it was fire in edible form. The gods did not speak in words. They spoke in flame, in sacrifice, in breath stolen away. To choke on fire was to mirror the sun devouring the sky at dusk. To burn from within was to pay back the cosmic debt of life, inch by inch. Some say the condemned never made a sound, that there was dignity in the end, that even as the cords tightened, the victim's eyes remained locked on the heavens, unblinking, unafraid. Others say they wept tears not of cowardice, but of cleansing, that the final breath was not for mercy, but for memory, for the ancestors, for forgiveness that might echo louder than the pain. The jungle does not distinguish between sinners and saints, but it remembers. And sometimes, if you listen closely on nights when the wind shifts through the canopy just right, you may hear it, the hiss of rope pulled taut, the crackle of fire within a human chest, and the breathless plea that never made it past a scorched throat in these forests. The vines grow thick and wild over the bones of both priest and prisoner. Roots curl. Through broken skulls, ferns sprout from jawbones, and in the damp stillness, life continues, ignorant of the violence that once gave it rhythm. But the stones remember, and the earth still burns where the cords once lay. Tonight, under a crescent moon, the jungle sighs again. The trees lean close, whispering a memory into the dark, a memory of a punishment not meant for pain, but for purification, not merely to kill, but to cleanse. A memory of red ropes, chilly fire, and lungs turned to embers, and silence, always. Silence where the last breath once burned, in the shadowed hush of Roman twilight, when the marble gods of the Forum wore their silence like veils and the oil lamps flickered against the breath of windless streets. A strange and sacred ritual, unfolded not of blood or blade, but of forgetting. Not death by spear or slow poison, but a death far more haunting. The erasure of existence itself. It began, always, with whispers. A name spoken in fear, then in anger, then no longer spoken at all. A decree etched in ink and ash by the senates. Hand carried like funeral incense through the empire's arteries. Damnatio memoria, they called it, damnation of memory. A punishment more final than execution. For the soul might drift in the afterlife, but the memory, once damned, was gone from the world of the living, like smoke into a moonless sky in the time of Emperor Domitian. The night seemed to tighten its grip on the heart of Rome. His rule had grown cruel, bloated with suspicion and vanity. He demanded to be addressed as Lord and God. Statues of his likeness rose like marble phantoms across the empire. He painted himself into Rome's story as if it would never end. But Rome had other plans. After his assassination in the quiet of his own palace, slain not by barbarians, but by his own servants, the Senate rose like vultures from slumber. In chambers thick with the weight of politics and dust, they passed judgment not just on the man, but on his memory. His name was scraped from every inscription, every stone. His face chipped away from coins with knives, his marble busts shattered. And buried, like a ghost too dangerous to linger, Domitian was exiled from remembrance. The process was sacred in its violence. In the middle of the night, workmen moved through temples and public spaces, carrying chisels instead of swords. Statues were toppled onto stone, their noses broken first, then their eye symbols of sight and breath and soul. Mosaics were pried from the floor, coins were melted down. Domitian's name was struck from scrolls and public records, as though the ink itself recoiled from it. And where once his likeness had stood in marketplaces and forums, now only jagged plinths remained monuments not to power, but to the horror of absence. But memory is a creature more stubborn than marble. Even in silence Domitian lingered. Roman citizens whispered of him behind closed shutters, referring to the one who is not spoken of, and sometimes, in flickering candlelight, children traced the gouged outlines of his face on ruined walls, asking who had lived there before. The stone went blind. The air itself seemed heavy with his name, though none dared utter it. Historians in later centuries would discover the evidence of his unmaking like forensic mourners. In palaces, they found altars with inscriptions cut midway through Demetia, and then nothing. In the deep layers beneath temples, they uncovered fragments of statues, heads severed and hidden as if to deny their gaze. And sometimes they found odd absences to clean. Too deliberate, like someone had reached into time itself and pulled a figure from the canvas, leaving only a ghost-shaped wound. Damnatio memoria was not just punishment, it was ritual. It was erasure as performance, erasure as revenge. It declared that history belonged not to truth, but to those who held the chisel, and it was not reserved for emperors alone. It was used on wives accused of treachery, generals fallen from grace, philosophers who dared speak against the order. They were cut from the story like infected limbs, not buried but unwritten. And yet, even in ruin, they remained. There is something perversely immortal in forgetting, for when a name is forbidden, it grows teeth in the dark. It becomes legend. Myth, warning. The faceless busts of Domitian still sit in quiet museum corners, their features worn smooth by centuries of shame. The missing names on arches and monuments speak more loudly than those still legible, and the silence where his statue once stood roars in the dead hours of night, when even Rome's stones seem to exhale memory. You might stand in the ruins and feel it, the void that was him. Not his presence, but his absence, echoing louder than footsteps on ancient flagstones. The place where a man once ruled as God and now is nothing. And perhaps that is the truest punishment of all, to not be hated, not feared, not even pitied, but forgotten, and in being forgotten, to become eternal. They say silence has a sound. If you listen long enough, not the hush of wind or the creak of wood, but a deeper silence, one shaped by breath, withheld by lives suspended by words that were never allowed to bloom. In the heart of Topkapi Palace, beneath the veils of silk and ceremony, there once lay a quiet so vast it swallowed entire lifetimes, not death, not sleep, but a kind of breathless waiting, trapped behind golden bars and embroidered curtains, where the only witness was time itself. The palace stood like a dream carved into stone. Marble courtyards caught the glow of dawn in their cool veins. Cyprus, Trees swayed above the domes, whispering to the sea just beyond the walls. But within, past the great gates and the tiled halls and the honeycombed pavilions, there was a hush so dense it weighed like iron, behind thick doors with no windows. Past rooms unmarked and unnamed were chambers no one spoke of aloud. The walls here did not echo, for nothing was spoken. No song, no laughter, no grief. Only the pulse of blood in ears, the scratch of nails on stone, and the endless solitude of women made into shadows. They called it the cage, not made of steel, nor iron bars, but something far more suffocating: silence. Silence so complete it became a second skin. The women inside were not criminals, nor prisoners of war. They were concubines chosen, not for punishment, but preservation. A royal bloodline had to remain untainted. Too many sons, too many mothers, and the empire would bleed from within. So they were hidden, cloistered behind scented walls. Dozens, maybe hundreds, breathing in the same stale air, their names forgotten before they were ever whispered. Each one a ghost in waiting. No one recorded their words, because they were not allowed to speak them. The Ottomans kept detailed records: deaths, marriages, executions, but not this. Not the women in the cages. The silence was too sacred, or too shameful. Even the most loyal scribes left these pages blank. And so we are left with hints. A floor plan with rooms too small for luxury, too many for coincidence. A doorway leading to nowhere. Tiles in a pattern that ends abruptly. A wall too thick, too soundproof. In the royal archives, there's a corner missing. Not erased, just never filled in. Hearsay speaks louder than parchment. An old gardener, interviewed long after the empire fell, once claimed he heard soft humming through the wall. As a boy, a song not meant to be heard, rising from a place where light never reached. Another account, from a French emissary in the 18th century, describes a hallway lined with locked doors and a smell of jasmine so strong it made him ill. No guards, no servants, just an emptiness that felt ... full, and always the silence. Not peace, but silence like a sentence. Some say the concubines in the cages never died, that their bodies were taken through secret tunnels and buried far from court, away from the tombs of sultans and princes. But no bones have been found, no markers, no names. Their absence is so complete it feels intentional. Others believe they were poisoned slowly, over years, their minds slipping into sleep from lack of sun and speech. But this is only rumor. What is known, if anything, can be known in a place built of whispers. That silence can be more brutal than chains. Imagine a girl of 14, gifted to the Sultan as tribute from a distant province. Her hair oiled, her lips dyed, her eyes lined with kohl. She enters the harem expecting music, rivalry, power, perhaps love. Instead, she is led to a door that closes behind her and never opens again. No one explains. She is not beaten. She is not spoken to. There is water, there is food, there is air, but no touch, no name, no future. Days lose their shape, dreams unravel into silence, and yet they lived. For years, some say, walking soft circles in tiny rooms, tracing cracks in walls, like maps, counting footsteps as though they led somewhere. They braided their hair into tight spirals. They folded cloth again and again until it felt like prayer. They memorized the texture of dust. They watched spiders weave kingdoms above their heads and envied their freedom. Some may have whispered, to themselves, so softly even their own ears could not catch the words. Others never spoke again. What madness is bred in stillness? What legends are born not from battles, but from the long endurance of being unseen? It was not cruelty alone that birthed this silence, it was control. The Sultanate feared bloodlines, branching to wide loyalties, fraying with too many heirs. If a concubine birthed a son and that son died or was denied, she became a liability, her very breath a threat, easier to hide her, to keep her away from politics, from men, from life. Not killed, not quite forgotten, but folded into the fabric of the palace like a crease in silk dot today. Tourists walk the courtyards of Topkapi. They marvel at the tiles, the gold leaf, the ornate lattice screens. They speak in hushed awe of the harem and its intrigues, the gilded chambers and their painted ceilings. But few know to ask about the doors that do not open, or the rooms with no windows. The guides do not speak of them. The blueprints are incomplete. The silence continues. And perhaps that is the final cruelty, that even now we do not know their names. We cannot say them aloud, let alone remember their faces. Their lives were songs never sung, stories never written. What remains is the hush, a hush so deep it hums beneath the stones like a buried river. In the end, they were not murdered, not burned, not broken on wheels. They were simply ... silenced, locked behind a hush so absolute history could not echo through it. And in that silence we hear them. Or perhaps it is only the wind brushing against ancient walls. But if you stand still long enough, you might feel it too, that soft pressure in the chest, that echo of breathless waiting. Not ghosts, not memories, just a silence heavier than time, lingering in rooms where no words were ever allowed to live, in the shadowed folds of time, where silence weeps through the corridors of the past like drifting incense smoke. There lies an echo that no wind dares carry. It is a soundless cry, a vow sealed in blood, a whisper of steel drawn in solitude. Beneath the lacquered rafters of a wooden hall, surrounded by kneeling figures in solemn stillness, a blade was raised not in battle, not in rage, but in dignity, despair, and devotion. This was not murder. It was not mere death. It was seppuku, ritual passage into the other world carved along the lines of honor. In feudal Japan, where the soul of a warrior was more sacred than breath, it was not how one lived, but how one died, that marked a man eternal. The year could have been any in the long, mournful stretch of the Edo era, when peace wore the mask of fragile stillness, and the swords of samurai found more use in ceremony than combat. The bamboo forests stood in reverent silence, listening to the breath of men who had once slain 4 lords, but now stood guard against dishonor itself. Tokyo, still called Edo then, did not, Rorit whispered, with the rustle of silk robes and the hushed steps of those who carried grief as honor. In the courtyards of daimyo mansions and shogunate palaces, the tomi mats were laid not only for celebration, but also for endings. The ceremony was sacred, every gesture deliberate, every breath measured. White robes, signifying purity, draped the body like the mist clings to the foothills of Mount Fuji. Before the kneeling samurai, a short blade rested atop a folded clother. Tantu, its polished edge reflecting not only his face, but the weight of his life. To one side, a second man knelt, silent and still, his blade sheathed in stillness. The Kishakunin, the appointed second, held the burden of mercy. This was no execution. This was a script etched by centuries, a theater of loyalty, shame, and redemption. For a samurai whose loyalty had faltered, or whose lord had fallen, there existed no prison, only the final act performed before witnesses, in obedience to a code older than the wood beneath their feet. Bushido, the way of the warrior, did not end in old age. It culminated in a graceful severance between body and soul. The act began in silence, broken only by the breath of the condemned. He would bow, take the blade in trembling hands, and without haste plunge it into his left abdomen. The blade would then be drawn across to the right and upward in a final, torturous gesture. Eyes wide but dry, tears were dishonor, groans were disgrace. Dying with dignity meant to die in stillness, in the midst of one's own spilled intestines. But rarely did a man finish this alone. The agony was not the point, it was the form. Once the blade had drawn its crimson arc, the Kishakunin, with blade already unsheathed, would rise and, without warning or pause, slice clean through the neck with a single stroke. A perfect cut, not all the way through, just enough to sever life and preserve the face. It was an art as much as a killing, a final mercy offered by a friend or trusted comrade. And then the silence returned, the hush after the storm, like the still pond after a stone sinks. The attendants would wipe the blade, fold the blood-soaked garments, and prepare the body for burial. The mourners would not cry, they would bow, and the tale of the man's death would be told not as tragedy, but as poetry. In the moss-covered graveyards of Tokyo, beneath ancient pine trees and the weight of quiet centuries, lie the remains of those who chose death over disgrace. Archaeologists, peeling back time like rice paper, have uncovered skeletons with neat, deliberate slices across the abdomen. Bones tell no lies, no flailing, no randomness, only the clean arc of practiced ritual. Some show signs of decapitation, clean and purposeful, as if the skull had been lifted gently by the wind. And perhaps it had, for in the myths of the samurai, the soul does not rise screaming. It drifts. It lifts like mist from the forest floor, like the breath from a steaming cup of tea in winter. Honor was not lost in blood. It was found in it, redeemed in it. The red upon white was not shamit, was scripture. There is a tale, soft as falling snow, told in the quietest corners of Nara's temples, of a warrior named Hirano no Tadamasa. Once a proud retainer, he lost favor through no fault of his own only, the shifting winds of courtly betrayal. His lord, poisoned in his sleep, left him with a choice, exile or the blade. And so, in the pale dawn, beneath the cherry blossoms just beginning to bloom, Tadamasa prepared for his end. He chose his eldest son as Kishakunin, though the boy had never drawn blood. The father instructed him gently, as one teaches a child, to write his name firmly, with love. The boy wept silently and vowed not to fail. When the time came, Tadamasa knelt, performed the rite, and gave his son a final look, filled, not with fear, but with pride. The sword flashed, the cherry petals fell, and the wind carried no cry. The boy did not speak for days, but the priests said the cut was perfect, and that the soul of Hirano no Tadamasa had passed on with honor intact. And that was all that mattered. It is said that blades used in seppuku ceremonies were never used again. They were wrapped in silk, buried in shrines, or broken because they had served their only true purpose: to open the gates of the other world with dignity, to etch the final kanji upon a life lived by the sword. And so we reflect, in the quietude of midnight, what it means to die with purpose. In a world that fears endings, the samurai embraced it as a return, not a fall, but a folding, like a scroll being sealed, like the last note in a song played in a forest clearing where no one listens, but everything remembers. The graves remain, the bones are silent, but the echo lingers. In the hush before dawn, in the stillness between breaths, in the weight of decisions made with clear eyes and trembling hands, to die by the blade is not always a tragedy. In the old ways of the warrior, it was a final gift, a silence deeper than shame, a red slash of memory across the white robe of history. And in that stillness, perhaps, there is peace. They say the sand remembers, even now, long after the empires have fallen into the hush of time, long after the camels no longer tread those ancient roads with bells that chimed like whispered prayers. The earth beneath Gao still weeps quietly in the night. Wind dances over the ruins like fingers through prayer beads, and when the moon is high and silver, casting the desert in ghostlight, shadows form along the broken walls, shadows shaped like men kneeling, like arms raised not in praise, but in punishment. This was the Mali Empire, centuries ago, a land of gold and scribes, of holy cities and blood-washed marketplaces. It was the age of kings draped in flowing indigo, of blacksmiths who forged justice as sharply as blades. But beneath the grandeur, beneath the cadence of chants rising, from the mosques of Timbuktu, there thrived another truth, one chiseled in bone and hammered into flesh. Justice here was not blind. It stared, unflinching, and it bit. It followed the law of Talion. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, a hand for a theft. The kings believed in balance, but not mercy. And so, in the marketplaces, where saffron and salt once glimmered beneath, the sun, the cries of punishment became part of the air. Theft was the gravest sin, for it robbed not only the body, but the soul. In a world where every grain of millet could mean life or death, to steal was to curse. And so, in broad daylight, before gathered crowds, the condemned were dragged to the center of the square, where the dust was soaked with older blood, and the stones still remembered the weight of screams. Their wrists were tied with thick cords, stretched tight until the hands turned blue. No blindfold, no prayers. The executioner, robed in silence, would draw his blade, often curved like a crescent moon, and sever the limb in a single blow. If the thief had stolen with the right hand, it was the right hand that fell. If again with the left, then the left. And if more than once, the ankles. Eventually, only the stumps remained, the life whittled down to the consequences of greed. But it did not end there. The dismembered limbs were not discarded into shadows. They were displayed nailed to thick logs, driven into the ground at the edge of the market, like grotesque trees bearing the fruit of crime. Iron nails, blackened by sun and rust, pierced through bone and tendon, and the smell lingered. Even after the flesh shriveled and cracked, even after the wind tried to carry the memory away, the warning remained. Silence settled in those markets, not out of peace, but out of fear. Parents pointed to the nailed stumps as they clutched their children close. Merchants polished their scales and locked their chests tight at dusk, and the scribes, ever faithful to ink and truth, wrote it all down. In the manuscripts of Timbuktu, between verses of philosophy and geometry, there are pages yellowed by time that tally the limbs as though they were coins. 2 hands for grain, 1 foot for goats, 3 stumps for a caravan's worth of salt. The flesh became currency, and justice a ledger with no forgiveness. Beneath the shrines that dot the land around Gao, archaeologists found bones, not buried in reverence, but discarded like relics of shame. Many had iron still embedded in them, nails driven through the wrists, the ankles, the forearms. Some were children. Others bore the marks of prior breaks, healed unevenly, suggesting repeated offenses or perhaps simply repeated accusations. There was no trial, only the hand of vengeance, swift, ritualistic, inevitable. There is an old tale told in the villages that sit near the Niger's bend, a story of a man named Bandiagara, a craftsman with hands so skilled they seemed kissed by spirits. He carved masks for ceremonies, doors for shrines, and talismans for kings. But one season the grain ran low, and Bandiagara's children cried from hunger. Desperate, he stole a sack of millet from a merchant's storehouse in the dead of night. He was caught by the morning. He did not beg. He only asked that his right hand be spared, the hand that shaped the gods in wood. But law is deaf. His hand was taken. Days later, another theft. This time the left. Bandiagara had nothing left to hold a tool, and so he starved, silent and forgotten. But the masks he carved remain in dark shrines, smooth and eternal, staring into eternity with hollow eyes. The people speak his name only in whispers, and the wind that moves through the shrines hums like a lament. It is easy to believe that brutality faded with the empires, that dust buried cruelty along with gold. But some nights, when the stars hang low and the fire crackles soft in the silence, old men sit by the crumbling walls of Gao and say the nails are still there, rusted, twisted, waiting. They say, if you press your ear to the stone, you can hear the weeping of justice long spent, the kind that does not ask questions, the kind that counts bone before breath. And if you ask why, they will not answer, for what is there to say? In those days, silence became survival. In the echoing hollows where judgment rang louder than truth, it was safer not to speak. Safer to nod. Safer to look away. But the ground does not forget. The sand, ever watchful, bears witness. And in the pale light of dawn, when shadows stretch long and thin, you might see them, the ghosts of hands nailed to wood, fingers curled as if still trying to hold on to life. A marketplace turned mausoleum. Justice, not as mercy, but as memory, as warning, as wall. And so we remember not just the splendor of empires, but the darkness they cast. For every golden manuscript in Timbuktu, there was a bloodied stump beneath it. Every shrine gilded in faith stood on ground stained with agony. And yet, in that contradiction, something human lingers, raw, brutal, and sacred. Because in the end, what remains is not the bones or the blood, not the nails or the ledgers, but the silence. And silence, in the oldest places of the world, is never empty. Night fell like ink over the Valley of Mexico, thick and breathless, cloaking the stone temples in shadows as deep as the underworld. The stars, scattered like the bones of gods, stared down coldly from the heavens, bearing witness to the rituals of men below. There, in the sacred courtyard of Tenochtitlan, beneath the brooding gaze of Huitzilopochtli, god of war and sun, a silence sharper than obsidian held the air. It was not the quiet of peace but of anticipation, stretched tight like the string of a bow drawn back. The Templo Mayor rose like a jagged tooth against the sky, its steps painted in layers of old blood, its edges bathed in torchlight. Incense coiled in the air sweet, bitter, wholly mixing with the scent of sweat, fear, and centuries. The drums had ceased. The chants, too, had ended. Now only the flame crackled. Now only breath remained. And then even that stopped. He stood. At the center of the courtyard, arms stretched wide, bound at the wrists. A prisoner, yes, but also an offering. His chest was bare, painted in streaks of red and black, and his head tilted slightly toward the sky, where the moon hovered pale and still, watching with 1,000 unblinking eyes. Around him, archers stood in a ring, motionless, like jaguars before the pounce. Their bows, strung with woven sinew, glinted in the firelight. Each arrow fletched with feathers bright, sacred, cruel. This was not battle. This was temporal death, not carved by knife, but sung by flight. An execution turned ceremony. A punishment turned prayer. They did not fire all at once. That would have been mercy. The first arrow pierced the thigh, thudding into flesh with a sound too soft to match its violence. The man shuddered but did not cry out. The second arrow lodged in the shoulder, spinning him slightly in place. Then another, and another leg's arms, ribs until the body was no longer a man, but a shrine of wood and blood. And still he stood, held upright by ropes and will, his breath coming in ragged sobs that vanished into the sky like smoke. The final arrow was always aimed at the heart, but no one knew whose hand would let it fly. That was left to the gods. Sometimes it was the youngest, sometimes the oldest, sometimes it was the one whose arrow had missed its mark, but always it struck true in the end. Always it was silent. When the last arrow sang through the night and buried itself in the man's chest, he jerked once, then sagged. The ropes went taut. His chin fell forward. And then, like a puppet whose strings had been severed, he crumpled to the earth. The silence afterward was not emptiness. It was sacred, thick, unbending, the kind of silence that hums inside the chest, the kind that hangs like a spell over stone. And the people watched, not in horror, not in pity, but in awe. For to die by arrows was not only a punishment, it was a message, a purification. The body, pierced again and again, became a vessel emptied of sin. Each shaft a penance, each wound a syllable of a forgotten prayer. The Aztecs believed the blood called the sun back from its descent into night, that the fluttering feathers of arrows echoed the flight of the soul toward the heavens. But the truth is darker, more tender, more terrifying. Sometimes the condemned were not guilty. Sometimes they were rivals. Sometimes they were offerings given not in atonement, but in strategy. Diplomacy etched in blood. A reminder to all that the gods do not sleep, and neither do kings. Beneath the Templo Maya, archaeologists would one day find the bones' long femurs pierced clean through, ribs shattered by narrow shafts, vertebrae split like dry bark. Some skeletons were small, disturbingly so, children, perhaps, or adolescents plucked from war captives. No names, only holes where life once lived. Arrowheads of obsidian, glassy and black, still lodged in the marrow. They found them near the platforms where sacrifices were made, arranged not in chaos, but in order. A ritual choreography preserved in death. There were no shields here, no cries of mercy, only the wind whispering through the temple stones, and the silence of those who had watched. Legends say the ground trembled after such nights, not from the weight of bodies, but from the memory that the gods stirred in their sleep, sated, that those who walked near the Templo Maya in the grey hour before dawn would hear the soft hiss of arrows in the air, long after the feathers had rotted away. They say one emperor, whose name is now lost to smoke and erosion, once stood beside a prisoner bound for the arrow, not to watch, but to speak. No one knows what he said, only that he wept when the final arrow struck, not for the man, but for himself, because he, too, knew that no one escapes the volley forever. That power buys time, but not eternity, and the silence endures. The stones still bear the stains. The stairs still remember the rhythm of bodies falling. And at night, when the world is quiet and the stars look down with that same ancient stare, the echo of feathered death hums in the dust. It is not the scream that haunts, it is the pause just before the held breath, the tension of a string pulled tight, the waiting, and the final sacred silence.